Welcome to part 6 of my presentations on New England OA, Sleepers and Showstoppers. I'm Roy Wetherbee. I'm a life member of ISCA, and this is part 6 of a 6-part presentation on New England OA. I was the Blue Book regional editor for the first 6 printed volumes of the Blue Book. I was also an ASTA area VP, Northeast Region VP, and the ISCA Northeast Region VP for the first 10 years of ISCA. So I have a pretty solid background in the New England area. I'm a past lodge advisor at Packagug Lodge 525 back in the mid-90s. And I'm currently the advancement chairman for Troop 114 Shrewsbury, Mass., my son's troop. I've been collecting since 1977 when I attended my first jamboree, which was actually the Canadian Jamboree in 1977. That's where I caught the patch trading bug. And I've been focused on New England OA since 1987 when Rob Cutts published his New England Memorabilia book. So the New England OA Sleepers and Showstoppers presentations are 6 parts covering 75 lodges in my area here. I've divided the presentation into these 6 parts, and we started in the northeast corner, and we're going to end up in the southwest corner of New England with part 6 covering 9 lodges in Southwest Connecticut. This part of Connecticut has currently 3 active lodges and 6 merged ancestor lodges. And it actually includes 2 of the smallest lodges in the country. So the 3 active lodges are ACHEWON NETOPALIS 427, which is a council comprised of 1 town, Greenwich, Connecticut, or Greenwich, Connecticut. We also have Pagasset Lodge 553, which is 5 fairly small towns in Connecticut, so another really small lodge. These 2 lodges, 427 and 553, are the 2 most difficult lodges to collect in my area just because they are so small. And then finally, we'll cover Owneco Lodge 313, which chartered in 1998, and it has a number of predecessors. So it was formed by the merger of Tankatiki 313 and Arcoon 369. They had merged in 1998. Tankatiki, in turn, had formed in 1973 from the merger of Mauwehu 389, Chief Pomperog 408, and Ponus Lodge 521. And Arcoon 369 had originally been named Chi Sigma Lodge 369, chartered in 1947. Blue Book records show the name change occurred in 1954. It actually occurred before that. The lodge recognizes its start date as 1951. And then Wangunks Lodge 274, which chartered in 1944, was absorbed in 1978 by Arcoon 369. There was no merger or name change associated with that. So these are the lodges that we'll be covering in this presentation, and I'll lead off with some showstoppers. So as a collecting discipline, first flaps are always sought after by collectors. And so we'll just lead off with the first flaps from this area. Wangunks 274 issued their S1. They were chartered in the 1940s, and yet they did not issue their first flap until the mid-1960s, and that would be the 274 S1. And then we have Lodge 369, and they have an F1 flap that dates to the mid-1950s. Mauwehu 389 has an uncommon first flap that also dates to the 1950s. And then Chief Pomperog Lodge 408 has an F1, was reordered at least once because there are a couple of different 12 varieties of that flap. And then the next 4 lodges, ACHEWON NETOPALIS 427 has a very sought after first flap with the rounded bottom there. The toughest first flap in this grouping of lodges would be the 521 F1. That's a ranking of like an 8 or a 9 in the original First Flap series. It's a pretty tough flap. No name on it, no number on it, just the lodge totem WWW, and a distinctive kind of stitching along the lower border that's meant to look like it was hand stitched on. And then Pegasset 553, their first flap dates to 1961 or so. Again, uncommon due to the small size of the lodge. And then finally, Tankatiki 313, the yellow border flap was their charter member flap. And it's now accepted as the F1, although the red bordered version for a very long time had been considered the F1. It's now the F2. And then the Owneco 313 first flap I had shown on one of the previous slides. So those are the first issues. And then in terms of some showstoppers, most of my presentations have started out looking at Wabaningo issues as the showstoppers. And this part of Connecticut actually didn't have any issues that were pictured in the Wabaningo Handbook, which was Dwight Bischel's publication in 1952, the first collector's book to actually have pictures of OA emblems in it and lodge listings and such. So no WOBs from this part of the country or this part of the area. But these are some pretty notable early issues. The 274 R1 is fairly difficult. It's extremely difficult to find in mint condition. And then the 369 Arcoon X1 felt, another tough early felt from the early to mid 1950s. And then finally, the Chief Pomperog 408A1. Chief Pomperog's totem was a cougar or a mountain lion, but in the earliest days, they had adopted the wolf totem from Mauwehu 389 because that was the lodge that had helped them get started, and it was the 389 ceremonies team that had come to this lodge and conducted their first ordeal. So there was a strong connection between those two neighboring lodges. And on their earliest issue here, they did use the Mauwehu 389 totem on their first issue patch here, the 408A1. And then looking at some additional showstoppers. So Mauwehu 389, which we discussed a minute ago, actually had 2 different Caldwell pins. And of course, Caldwell pins are always showstoppers. The upper left picture shows their Brotherhood pin, and the lower left picture shows the Vigil version of their Caldwell pin. And then the very first bullion issued anywhere in New England was this special lodge award that was issued by ACHEWON NETOPALIS 427. They issued 12 of these in the early 90s, and it's extremely rare. So these are the patches that I can consider the biggest showstoppers in this part of Connecticut. And then these are newer. These are chenilles, but these chenilles are huge, and they're both sleepers and showstoppers because they are so scarce that most people will not have seen them. So on the left, there's this big chenille jacket patch that 427 issued as part of their 70th anniversary. They made 70 of them for their 70th anniversary. And then I have their 70th anniversary flap pictured next to it just for scale. And then on the right, for their 40th anniversary back in 2002, Pegasset Lodge 553 issued this fairly giant chenille jacket patch for their lodge. The 553A1 next to it is much more common, but it's there again for scale because that's a 4-inch tall patch. So you can see that the chenille is like between 10 and 12 inches tall, quite large for a chenille. And these I would both consider showstoppers as well. So moving on to the first lodge, the oldest lodge in this part of Connecticut would be Wangunks 274. And we already saw their R1, which I'd consider their rarest patch. But here in terms of sleepers, their 25th anniversary in 1969 is a patch that you just don't see. I can't remember the last time I saw one available. So I'm thinking if I haven't seen it in a long time, neither has anyone else. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a couple actually rejects or factory samples made from S2s. So the first flap, the S1 that we saw earlier, is actually their most common patch. Their S2 with the vertical embroidered background is much rarer if you're an issue collector, much harder to find. And on the upper right-hand side here, we have a black border patch that for a while was thought to have been like a privately ordered death flap for when they merged. And then later on, we found the red kind of cut edge version below it. And in both cases, these are flawed errors of the S2 flap. So there's a big thread break error in the green on the right-hand side of that upper flap with the black border. And then the one below it's missing the first W. So these are both errors that were likely culled and set aside by the patch company. But what companies would do back in those days is, people would write to them for samples and they'd send their samples out in the mail. And sometimes they would just grab something out of the trash, slap a border on it, and mail it out. I don't necessarily understand why a company would send out rejects as samples of their quality work, but this happened quite often back in those days. So, and that those S2 flaps date to like the early 70s. So they're in there just because there are others out there. And if you see a 274 S2 with a weird border, should be a red rolled edge. But if you see anything other than that, it's likely an error or somehow flawed in some way. So moving on to Arcoon 369, some of their most difficult patches are their past chief flaps. They had yellow borders and would issue these 2 per person to their chiefs. So of course, that's a pretty limited audience. And as a result, these are all very rare. So starting way back in the, I think this is S5, which is the yellow border version of their S4. That dates to like the mid 1970s or so. This was used for a number of years, so it's the most common of these. And then in 1981, they had a yellow border added to their anniversary flap, and they did the same thing in 86 with a gold mylar border there. The top 2 in the middle column are 2 different loom runs, and so they are different, but the differences are pretty minor. And to people who aren't paying attention, these 2 will look very similar. And then at the bottom of the middle column is a version with gold mylar, which was meant to signify a chief who served multiple terms. So this was special in that it was changed by the lodge advisor when the lodge advisor's son had been the lodge chief for multiple terms. So it was a bit of a special circumstance, special issue. But when they resumed, chief flaps for the later loom runs, they kept the gold mylar border here for a couple of issues. And then finally, that very last flap in the lower right corner was their chief flap for the last chief or 2, but because the lodge had inventory, they had leftovers, they also presented them to e-board members who were part of the merger committee. So these went to, a few youth members who had not served as chief. But again, not that many made, and it's pretty rare. One thing, a word of warning on the Arcoon chief flaps, there was a collector in the lodge who was unable to complete his collection. And he had taken a bunch of lodge flaps and pulled the borders off and sent them to a patch company and had borders sewn back on. So there are rebordered versions of all of these patches. So you have to be careful. The quick way to spot the real ones is the original manufacturer of these patches had a super flat rolled edge on all of them. On the left-hand side there, the 1986 isn't as flat as the others, but most of these have a really, really flat rolled edge. And if you find one with a full rolled edge on these earlier ones, there's a possibility that they're not legitimate. And in full transparency, the lower one in the middle column there with the gold mylar border is one of those rebordered flaps. And you can almost see from this angle that it has a full rolled edge. A lot of these with the flat rolled edge actually have like a clear back stitching on them. I am considering in the future doing a presentation specifically on fakes and how to tell them apart. So with these, though, you do have to be careful because there are some rebordered ones that are floating around out there. Good idea to, if you have one or see one, to run it by someone who knows the difference. And then sticking with Arcoon 369, they did issue this purple border flap back in the 90s that was an earned lodge award. It was pretty difficult to earn. So, and people could only earn it once. So in effect, if you earned it, it was a 1 per life flap. And as a result, it's very difficult to find. It was difficult to find at the time, and I haven't seen one in over 10 years. And then on the right, toward, in the last couple years of this lodge's existence, right before the merger, they issued a couple of jacket patches that were large reproductions of their early neckerchief patches. And the J2 was this felt version that was a large reproduction of their X1 felt, their first issue. I'm thinking it must have been more expensive than the twill version because the twill version J1 is quite common. And this felt version is extremely hard to find. So I'm thinking it must have been more expensive, so fewer people ordered it or bought it. And so it's rarer. And then finally, over on the lower left side is the chapter patch that was issued following the absorption of this lodge by Arcoon. So Wangunks was absorbed in 1978 and apparently formed a chapter and had their own issue for a while. And this is also probably the rarest or one of the rarest chapter patches from this lodge. So it's in there as well. Moving on to Mauwehu Lodge 389, we had already seen their first flap, which is a toughie, and their Caldwell pins, which are Showstoppers. These are some additional patches additional issues that are both extremely rare, very hard to find. So on the left here is a Vigil neckerchief. It's their N1. It simply has the Vigil symbol and the number 389. This is something that I don't have. And then they had their second issue had Mauwehu Lodge 389 around the Vigil totem. And that one's a little easier to find than the N1 here. In the middle there is this felt silk screened armband because there was the Region 1 regional OA conference in 1953 was actually hosted by this lodge, and service members that were on staff were issued these felt armbands. So it would have been wrapped around your arm and like pinned with a safety pin or something. It doesn't have snaps or anything. But it is the OA Conference Guide 389. It's undated, but the regional conference was 1953. This is a very tough piece as well. And then finally, in terms of sleepers, very often event patches tend to be sleepers because people go to the event. Perhaps it's not well attended and then the patches disappear. So this is a fellowship patch. It's the only event patch that we know of currently for this lodge happened back in 1957. I'm looking for any of these if anybody happens to have one. So moving on to Chief Pomperog 408. And this is a lodge where we saw the first flap, which is maybe a $50 piece. And we saw the A1, which is a much tougher piece. The 408 F3 is a very common flap. If you see this lodge on eBay, it's very likely the F3 flap. You know, it's easily had for $10 or less even. But the F2, you'll see, has the arrow going the other way. And the F2 is extremely rare. So you're talking, you know, probably a factor of 10 or 15 times rarer and more valuable than the F3. So what you want to look for is the arrow going to your right as opposed to the very common F3 with the arrow going to the left. That's a sleeper that I bet most people don't know about. Moving on to Ponus Lodge 521. We saw their F1 earlier, and that's definitely a showstopper. The majority of their other flaps are pretty common. You could put together a collection of all their flaps minus the F1 right now on eBay if you went there and were willing to pay the prices. What's not available at any price, it seems, are their neckerchiefs. So their N1 neckerchief, which was issued contemporaneously with their F1, is very rare. It's this kind of half red, half black neckerchief with the half black, half red silkscreen. I've only ever seen two. And then this one on the right, which I believe is their N2, is a silkscreen neckerchief. It comes later, quite a bit later, actually, because the neckerchief earned and issued between these two is actually a white neckerchief with a great big pie-shaped patch, which I haven't pictured in this presentation, but is a $600 to $900 piece by itself, and those neckerchiefs are very rare as well. But this N2, I have just a really bad picture of it in some display case just to prove that it exists. I've actually never seen this N2 in person, so it's definitely a sleeper. Really hard to find, and I need both of these as well, and I've been collecting for 45 years. So moving on to Tenkatiki 313, which for a long time we referred to as the Patch of the Month Club because they have many, 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 many lodge issues. But in terms of sleepers or patches you don't see very often, there is the 313 J2 with the silver mylar border. They had a dance team and they had a red bordered jacket patch that they had issued as a fundraiser and was available to anyone in the lodge. The silver border dance team jacket patch was restricted to the dance team members themselves. So again, a smaller group within the lodge, and these were limited in their circulation. And then on the right there is their R1, and this was a patch that was typically worn on the front breast of a jacket, the lodge jacket. This is their first one. It's a twill background. It's a very crude lettering because I believe it was done in pretty small quantities on a hand loom. And you can actually see the design has been sketched with a fabric pen before it was embroidered. And if this had been using, you know, CNC controlled machines, that wouldn't have been necessary. So again, it was made in pretty small quantities. It was made in the early 70s. They came out with, you know, nicer solid embroidered versions pretty quickly. So the first version here is actually pretty hard to find. It's a 4-inch round, and I'd consider it a sleeper. I haven't seen one available probably in 25 years. Also tough from this lodge are any of their neckerchiefs, because their neckerchiefs were all one per life. So their earliest neckerchiefs were light blue with a yellow border and various embroidered designs in them. These just happen to be two examples that I picked because I did not have them. I just have photos of them. This is a little later. And then the version on red they issued in 1990 for the 75th anniversary of the OA. There's no lettering on it that would tell you that, other than just the red and white colors. And again, both are needs for me. And then events, because events are very often sleepers. And I'd say the toughest event patch from this lodge would be their 96 Fall Fellowship with the white border. So the white border was issued for the event staff, meaning, mostly e-board people and, activities committee people. And the regular issue had a red border, and that's, not that difficult. But the white border staff version of their Fall Fellowship 96 patch, extremely difficult. And I'm still looking for it. Here, the next two are ones that I do have, but for whatever reason, I found their 97 anniversary banquet patch tougher for some reason. It took me a while to get this. And so I've got it in there as an example of a sleeper. And then finally, the 1984 fellowship patch. The fellowship patch itself is not very difficult at all, but what is difficult are these segments that were earned, I'm assuming for participation, and went with it. So if you saw one of these segments, which, matched the bands in their lodge totem, which was this hoop of the universe, the white, yellow, green, black, white, yellow, green, black, those segments, particularly once they're separated from the fellowship patch, lose all context, and you would just never know what they were if you didn't know that these segments went with that patch. So a group of definite sleepers there. So moving on to the current Owneco Lodge 313, I'd say some of their most difficult sleepers and perhaps even showstoppers here are what are currently listed as jacket patches, but these are in fact large vigil honor totems that are sewn on blankets that are presented to their vigils, one per person. So these are originally sewn on blankets, and they have a couple of earlier versions, and then they came back with this J12, which would be their current vigil blanket patch with the red background, just to be more consistent with the actual vigil totem. But these are all one per life vigil members only, very difficult to find. And again, in 1998, which is just 2 years after that earlier fellowship patch with the white border, the two lodges met for a fall fellowship in late 1998. This is where they voted on things like the new lodge name and the new lodge totem and ironing out the actual details of the merger. These two lodges came together at the beginning of the weekend as separate lodges, and they left as a new lodge. And again, the regular fellowship patch had a red border, but the staff version had a white border and is definitely much more difficult than the other. And then these next two arrowhead patches were issued by the lodge. So they had issued these patches to their service staff for 3 conclaves that they had hosted. So there's one with a black border that had been hosted in the mid 2000s. And then they had these Mylar border arrowhead patches for the 2010 NE2A conclave and the 2016 NE2A conclave. So I do have the first 2 patches on this page. I'm looking for the 2016 there myself. And then finally, looking at some of their chapters, they have a ton of chapters, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I just wanted to point out that most of their chapters have at least 2 versions of their patch. And the Mylar bordered versions of their chapter patches tend to be earned versions. So this was an earned chapter award that you could earn for that. So there's a yellow for Chief Pomperog chapter and a silver mylar for people who earned the participation version. There's also a red mylar version that was for the chapter chief. That's was reported to be unique, but I know of at least 3 in collections, so perhaps not so much. Pequot had a black border that you could buy, and they had the gold mylar border that you could earn. The same with Arcoon chapter. Keewaydin chapter here had a black border, and it's actually a yellow border. That's their difficult earned version. And then Chief Pomperog chapter here, which is a later version. Again, the gold mylar border is earned. They have several other chapters that follow kind of the same pattern. So in each case, like a yellow or gold border signifies a much more difficult version. And those are definitely sleepers. And so we'll move on to the second smallest lodge that we'll be covering. And as a result, most of what they issue are sleepers. I'm going to spend a lot of time on these last 2 lodges just because they have so many issues that are so difficult. And so starting here with Bagasset 553, their S2 with the black background was a Brotherhood flap, 2 per life at Brotherhood. And that was a tradition dating back to the mid-1960s. So that's been around for a really long time. I still consider it one of the toughest middle issue flaps in all of New England. It's very difficult to find. And then on the right, in the late 1980s, they issued this red background version of the flap for their vigil members. So again, vigil members would get 2 or could buy 2 upon completion of their vigil, or at that point, any grandfathered in vigil members could get them as well. This top version with the kind of squared off corners is the version that they had in the late 80s and the 90s. And then this version on the bottom here with the slimmer and more rounded corners is their current version of their vigil flap. Again, 2 per life, vigils only in a really tiny 5-town lodge. So again, you just don't see these very often. And then we have some more issues. So in 2005, this lodge earned the National Service Award. They actually earned it twice. They earned it in 2000 as well, and they issued a flap. And then they earned it again in 2005, and they issued another flap. And the normal version of this flap has a green face, which is consistent with their totem on all their other flaps. And somebody in the lodge going through the patch order noticed that, maybe a dozen or so had a white face. I've seen some patch companies actually intentionally change some of the coloring of flaps every so often. And that's probably what happened here. But the lodge had pulled out the flaps with the white face, and the lodge chief presented them as basically a special, chief's award or chief's gift as a thank you to certain members of the lodge. So that one's pretty difficult. And then for their 50th anniversary, they had 3 or 4 different borders of their flaps. They had a gold border, they had a green border. They had a red border where only 10 were made. So the red border here is extremely difficult. I don't have any of the flaps on this page because, again, it's a really tiny lodge and their stuff doesn't tend to travel. In the upper right corner, they did the same thing in 2015. So they had a couple of different borders of their NOAC flap, and the black border, again, there were only 10 made. So these are extremely difficult issues, all like a dozen or less made. And then finally, down in the lower right corner is a flap that I believe is current. It's a thank you gift from the lodge to lodge members who, I guess, perform, outstanding service in some way. It says thank you and then has thank you in maybe a dozen other languages here. Again, because it's not freely available. It's an award. This is a sleeper too. You just don't see it very often. And then these are their service corps. So they had flaps that were earned by performing service. The first one with the black border dates to, I think, at least the early 90s. The green borders maybe later 90s, early 2000s. These had to be earned. And I believe you could only earn them once. And then later iterations, they came up with, for the people who wanted to earn it more than once, they had a sequence of colored ones, ghost ones, that you could earn, where I believe the green and red were the easier to earn and the white and the black were more difficult. And if you happened to earn all four of them, there was the jacket patch that you could basically put them around this square looking 5x5 jacket patch, again for the service corps. At some point they switched to this kind of three-way design in the lower right corner, and a bunch of the jacket patches here popped up on eBay for fairly easy money, but the flaps themselves being earned are still very, very hard to come by. So again, now if somebody earns it, and maybe it's because it was hard to earn it 4 times in a row and it's more common to earn it 3 times in a row, but they have this new jacket patch here to display your 3 if you earn them. And now some super obscure pieces. This lodge had a couple of event patches back in the 70s that were so rare that their 78-1 was never listed in the Cuts book. It was never listed in Blue Book. It was only assumed to exist. The Winter Camp 2 patch in the middle was known to exist only because the lodge had it in their lodge collection, and they would bring that to NOAC and display. And so this was listed in the Cuts publications of the late 80s, early 90s. And but Winter Camp 1 here was only presumed to exist. And I think most people, until they saw the patch, assumed it would have been 1976 or 1977. But I believe, oh, maybe it's just a really misformed 1976, but it definitely looks like a 1978. This was just presumed to exist. It was so rare, nobody had ever seen it. And then in terms of odd shapes from this lodge, in 1979, they had this rectangular patch that their delegates took out to Fort Collins, Colorado for the 79 NOAC. It was their first NOAC issue, and it's also extremely rare. So 3 super sleepers there from this tiny lodge in Connecticut. So moving on to the smallest lodge in New England and possibly the country is one town, Greenwich, Connecticut. I'll start out with these issues, which are special awards. They're only awarded to somebody, 1 per person, and I believe fewer than 100 of each made and issued. The S4 here in the upper left corner last sold, the last one I saw sell on eBay went for over $2,000. It's that rare. When they ran out of these, they started issuing the white border version in the lower left-hand side. And when those ran out, they switched to a gold Mylar version. And their current version of this award is the blue Mylar version in the lower right corner. Super restricted, super rare. And then some other issues here that are hard to find. These are all special issues. So they had a series of 50th anniversary flaps for their lodge. There was a white twill that was a trader. You could just buy as many of those as you wanted for $5 in their lodge store or their council store. And then they had a full color version that was more in line with their standard lodge flap that was available to lodge members only. But then they had these two very special issues where the all gold Mylar ghost version of their 50th was earned, and it was their lodge members only. And then the one below it with the green witch was issued one per person to attendees at their 50th anniversary lodge banquet. So you had to go to the banquet to get one of those. Tiny lodge, tiny banquet, not many made, very hard to find. And then here we had a couple of, on the right-hand side, a couple of special awards that had been named after lodge members that I believe had passed away. So the Ben Evans flap and the Bert Sklar flap, are both very limited. I actually need the Bert Sklar flap myself. And then moving on to events, this lodge didn't have a ton of events, but the first event patch they issued was in 1993. It was designed by then lodge chief. The design was taken from their earliest silkscreen neckerchiefs. It's actually a really nice design. It's undated. And then following the, I believe, inspired by the 1995 OA Trail Crew at Philmont, they did an OA Trail Crew at their camp. So these are their camp patches, but overprinted with Trail Crew and a red arrow. And their first version here was a black border. And when those ran out, they reissued it here with a brown border. Both pretty obscure. And then their most recent lodge event would have been this fellowship that they did in 2000. They called it their Millennium event, this rectangle. So again, small lodge, small event, hard to find. And then later on, for their crew that went to Aero Corps 5 in 2008, they had this kind of, it's the bottom piece of a two-piece set, but there was no top piece for Aero Corps. It just happened to fit well with their lodge flap of the day, which had the same blue velvet background. And then for 2011, again, they did one for the Summit Corps crew, and the top flap was just their standard lodge flap. So again, because they sent a limited number of members to AC5 in 2008 and a limited number of members to the 2011 Summit Corps, these are both, they're both delegate issues, and they're pretty hard to come by. And then this lodge has issued 2 jacket patches. I mean, more recently, they issued that large chenille jacket patch for their 70th anniversary. But prior to that, they had done a 40th anniversary jacket patch back in 1989. I traded for this at the 1989 Jamboree and had never seen another one since. So these just dried up. The rumor is that, a few people in the lodge bought a bunch of them, and the market dried up. And then the 427 J2, this came out probably within the last 20 years or so. And again, lodge members only. And, the rumor is certain people bought a lot of them, and they're just sitting on them. I don't have the J2 myself, so it's something I'm looking for. And then in 2015, there was a group of flaps here. I don't have their NOAC issues pictured because those are readily available. They're not sleepers in any way. But in the upper left corner, there's a red background flap. It's like a modern reproduction of their F2, just with the colors reversed. And that was issued at their lodge banquet at the beginning of 2015. So again, you had to go to the banquet to get one. And then these other 3 Centennial flaps were part of they were sold in a portfolio as a set. The only way to get them was to buy this this portfolio with the 3 patches in them. But they have they had again, this version, kind of a homage to their F1 for the centennial. Then they have another one here. And then in the lower right, there is a red mylar bordered, red mylar lettering with OA-100. That's their centennial flap. And it's the same design as their NOAC flap. It's just that that's a plain red border, and it just says NOAC here, where above the centennial logo. So the NOACs were pretty common, but these 4 flaps on this page, again, it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time in order to get them. So that is Southwest Connecticut in a nutshell. What I'll do is I'll just, make a shameless plea for any of my needs. Going through that presentation, I need most of it, to be honest. But Caldwell pins, neckerchiefs, anything from 427. I need a lot of that stuff, particularly 427, because it's such a small lodge and it's so hard to collect. So anybody listening, if you ever run across any of these, I'd be interested. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll open it up to questions. This was part 6 of 6, but I am now considering doing a part 7, which will allow me to present on Connecticut chapter issues, specifically because Connecticut has just a ton of chapter issues, and I really wasn't able to do chapters justice in this presentation, and I'd like to talk about those specifically. So I might look forward to that presentation in June. So thank you for listening.